The guillotine, a name that echoes through history as the ultimate symbol of the French Revolution. Between 1792 and the final execution in 1977, tens of thousands met their end beneath its angled blade. But here's what most people miss. The guillotine wasn't designed to be a spectacle. It was engineered to be the opposite: swift, clinical, egalitarian. So why did executions draw crowds numbering in the tens of thousands? Why did people bring their children, pack lunches, and arrive hours early to secure a good view? The common answer is simple. People are morbid. They wanted to see death. But that explanation is incomplete and historically lazy. The real reason crowds gathered wasn't just about witnessing an execution. It was about something the guillotine fundamentally changed in how death was delivered by the state. Before we dismiss these spectators as merely bloodthirsty, we need to understand what they were actually watching, and more importantly, what they were not watching anymore. The guillotine represented a radical shift in the relationship between the public, the condemned, and state authority. The crowds weren't just there for death. They were there because the guillotine transformed execution from an unpredictable, chaotic event into something else entirely, a perfectly timed mechanical certainty. This video explores the obscure reason why the guillotine paradoxically attracted larger crowds than previous execution methods, despite being designed to be faster and less dramatic. The answer lies not in the device itself, but in what it removed from the execution process, and what that absence created in the minds of spectators. By the end, you'll understand why efficiency, not brutality, made the guillotine the greatest crowd puller in execution history. To understand the guillotine's crowd appeal, we must first understand what executions looked like before 1792. In pre-revolutionary France, execution methods varied by social class and crime. Nobles were beheaded by sword, a theoretically quick death that depended entirely on the executioner's skill. Commoners faced hanging, breaking on the wheel, or burning at the stake. These methods were intentionally prolonged, designed to maximize suffering as both punishment and public warning. Public executions were state-sponsored events held in major squares like the Place de Grève in Paris. Authorities viewed them as essential demonstrations of royal justice and divine order. The condemned were paraded through streets, allowing crowds to jeer or show sympathy. Executions could take hours, sometimes days, for methods like the wheel. The problem was consistency. Sword beheadings frequently required multiple strikes. Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson recorded instances where it took 3 or more blows to sever a head. The condemned would writhe, scream, and sometimes even speak between strikes. Hangings could go wrong, leaving the victim strangling for 15 minutes or more. These failures created sympathy for the condemned and undermined the state's authority. When Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin proposed his device to the National Assembly in 1789, he wasn't motivated by cruelty, but by Enlightenment ideals of equality and humaneness. Every person, regardless of rank, would die the same way. More importantly, they would die instantly, without the prolonged suffering that had characterized earlier methods. The guillotine was adopted officially in 1792. The first execution occurred on April 25th of that year, when highwayman Nicolas Jacques Pelletier was executed before a modest crowd. Within months, the device would be raised in the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, and the crowds would begin to swell exponentially. Here's the detail most historical accounts gloss over. The guillotine execution, from final words to completed death, took approximately 2 to 3 seconds. The condemned was strapped to a plank, tilted horizontal, locked into the lunette, the restraining collar, and the blade dropped. In the time it takes to draw a breath, it was finished. Compare this to the previous methods. A sword beheading could take minutes if the executioner was nervous or inexperienced. Hanging varied wildly based on the drop distance and the condemned's body weight. The wheel could take hours, with the executioner breaking limbs methodically while the victim remained conscious. Even in the best circumstances, old methods involved visible struggle, audible suffering, and the possibility of something going terribly wrong. The guillotine eliminated all variables. The blade weighed over 88 pounds and fell from a height of 14 feet, generating sufficient force to sever the neck completely in a fraction of a second. There was no skill involved beyond pulling the release mechanism, no possibility of a botched execution, no prolonged death throes. This is what drew attention, the absolute certainty. When a crowd arrived at the scaffold in 1785, they didn't know what they would witness. Would the execution take 1 strike or 5? Would the condemned beg for mercy? Would the executioner's nerve fail? Every execution was unique, unpredictable, and filled with human variables. But with the guillotine, everyone knew exactly what would happen. The condemned would be positioned. The blade would fall, the head would drop into the basket. 3 seconds, no variation, no uncertainty. This absolute predictability created a strange psychological effect. It made people want to see it precisely because there was nothing to see. The execution had been reduced to pure mechanical function. The guillotine's crowd-drawing power stemmed directly from its engineering. The device was designed to eliminate every possible source of human error or variation. Understanding its mechanical precision helps explain why it became such a compelling public spectacle. The blade itself was angled at approximately 45 degrees. This wasn't arbitrary. The angle created a slicing motion rather than a chopping impact, reducing the force needed while ensuring a clean cut through vertebrae and tissue. Early prototypes used straight blades, but these occasionally jammed in the neck bones, requiring a second drop. The angled blade solved this problem entirely. The mouton, the weighted block holding the blade, ran along 2 vertical grooves in the uprights. These grooves were greased before each execution, ensuring the blade fell at maximum speed with no friction-caused deviation. The consistency was remarkable. Whether the condemned was large or small, muscular or frail, the blade performed identically. The lunette restraint was equally important. It consisted of 2 half circles that locked around the neck, preventing any movement. Previous execution methods allowed the condemned to flinch, turn their head, or struggle, all variables that could affect the outcome. The lunette eliminated movement entirely, ensuring the neck was positioned precisely where the blade would pass. This mechanical perfection created an unusual psychological experience for spectators. There was no tension about whether the execution would succeed, no dramatic struggle, no uncertainty about timing. The guillotine had transformed execution from a chaotic human event into something resembling a factory process. Paradoxically, this very predictability made it more compelling to witness. When every execution is different, missing one doesn't matter. There will be variations next time. But when every execution is identical, witnessing it becomes about confirming the machine's absolute reliability. Crowds came to verify what they'd heard, that death by guillotine was so efficient it barely seemed real. The guillotine's social impact extended far beyond its mechanical function. It fundamentally altered the relationship between state power, public justice, and the crowd's role as witnesses. In the old regime, executioners were skilled craftsmen who served families held the position for generations. They possessed knowledge, strength, and a degree of autonomy. The Sanson family, for instance, served as Paris executioners for 6 generations. The executioner's skill directly affected the condemned's suffering, giving these men considerable power over the moment of death. The guillotine stripped away this human element. The executioner became a mere operator, pulling a lever. Anyone could do it. The machine, not the man, delivered death. This represented a profound shift in how state authority was demonstrated. Power no longer resided in the executioner's strength or precision. It resided in the state's ability to engineer and deploy a perfect killing mechanism. For spectators, this changed their role from witnesses of human judgment to witnesses of mechanical inevitability. They weren't watching one man kill another. They were watching the state operate a device that made death as certain as clockwork. This created a peculiar sense of participation. The crowd confirmed the machine's efficiency through their presence. The guillotine also democratized death in a way that resonated with revolutionary ideals. Aristocrats and commoners died identically on the same platform by the same method. When Louis XV was executed on January 21, 1793, he died exactly as thousands of commoners would, head in the lunette, blade falling 3 seconds from living king to severed corpse. The crowd witnessing this saw revolutionary equality made visceral and real. This symbolic leveling drew people who might never have attended a traditional execution. They came not for spectacle, but to witness the revolution's promise made manifest, that all citizens, regardless of birth, were equal before the machine of state justice. Several myths surround the guillotine's crowd appeal that need addressing. The most persistent is that crowds were simply more barbaric in the 18th and 19th centuries. That people then possessed a bloodlust modern society has evolved beyond. This is historically inaccurate and condescending. Contemporary accounts reveal that crowds at guillotine executions were often subdued, even solemn. The speed of execution left little room for the jeering, taunting atmosphere common at earlier executions. Dr. Guillotin himself noted that the first guillotine execution disappointed spectators precisely because it was over so quickly. One observer complained there was nothing to see. Another myth suggests crowds came to see severed heads and blood. While the guillotine certainly produced these, they weren't the primary draw. Previous execution methods were far more graphic. Burning at the stake, disembowelment, and breaking on the wheel all produced more visible suffering and gore. If spectators simply wanted graphic violence, they would have preferred the old methods. The myth that crowds were primarily lower-class ruffians is also false. Attendance records and contemporary descriptions show that guillotine crowds cut across all social classes. Merchants, clerks, women, and even children attended. Vendors sold food and drink. Some spectators rented window views in surrounding buildings. This wasn't a mob. It was a cross-section of society treating the execution as a public event, similar to a market day or festival. Perhaps the most misleading myth is that crowds were celebrating death. Many attendees came for political reasons, to ensure justice was served against enemies of the revolution, or later to witness the state's power. They came because the execution was newsworthy, because everyone was talking about it, because being there meant participating in history. Understanding these myths helps us see the truth. Crowds gathered not because they were cruel, but because the guillotine represented something unprecedented in human history. The guillotine's relationship with crowds wasn't uniform throughout its history. Understanding these variations reveals how changing contexts affected public attendance and perception. During the Terror, 1793 to 1794, executions reached industrial scale. On some days, dozens of people were guillotined in succession. Crowds during this period were largest, sometimes exceeding 20,000 spectators. These gatherings had distinct political overtones. Attendance was seen as a demonstration of revolutionary loyalty. The Committee of Public Safety encouraged public witness to these executions as civic duty. After Robespierre's own execution in July 1794, the frequency decreased dramatically. Crowds diminished but remained substantial for high-profile cases. The execution of Charlotte Corday, who assassinated Jean-Paul Marat, drew massive crowds not for the spectacle but for her political significance and reported composure on the scaffold. By the 19th century, executions had moved from the Place de la Révolution to the Place de la Roquette, outside the prison. Crowds became smaller and more controlled. Authorities began to question whether public executions served any deterrent purpose, given that spectators seemed to treat them as entertainment rather than moral instruction. Regional variations also existed. Guillotines were deployed throughout France and in territories under French control. In some provinces, executions drew smaller crowds due to lower population density. In major cities like Lyon and Marseille, crowds rivaled those in Paris, particularly during politically charged periods. Not every country that adopted the guillotine used it publicly. Some German states employed the device but conducted executions inside prison yards, eliminating the crowd element entirely. This reveals that the crowd dynamic wasn't inherent to the guillotine, but to French authorities' decision to maintain public executions. The final public guillotine execution occurred on June 17, 1939, when Eugen Weidmann was executed outside the Saint-Pierre prison in Versailles. Crowds had become rowdy, even taking photographs and filming. This behavior finally convinced French authorities to end public executions entirely. Here's the core paradox that explains the guillotine's crowd appeal. By removing drama, uncertainty, and human variables, the guillotine created a void that spectators needed to witness, for themselves to believe. Previous execution methods involved visible processes. You could watch a hanging victim struggle as consciousness faded. You could observe the executioner's technique with a sword, see him position his feet, measure the strike. There was something to analyze, discuss, critique. The execution unfolded in time, with multiple moments to observe and interpret. The guillotine collapsed this temporal process into an instant. There was nothing to analyze, no technique to evaluate, no prolonged moment to contemplate. Just before and after, with almost no during. This created a profound absence where spectacle had previously existed. This absence became the attraction. People came because others told them, "You won't believe how fast it is. There's nothing to it. It's over before you realize it began." These descriptions created curiosity precisely because they described a lack of experience. How could something so significant, the taking of a human life by state authority, be reduced to something so brief? The guillotine made death feel unreal. Spectators needed to confirm with their own eyes that a human being could genuinely be alive 1 second and deceased the next, with no transition, no process, no ceremony beyond the mechanical drop of a blade. The speed created cognitive dissonance that could only be resolved through direct observation. This psychological dynamic, being drawn to witness an absence, a void where drama should exist, had never occurred in execution history. Previous methods offered too much to see. The guillotine offered almost nothing, and that nothing became irresistible. Crowds came not despite the guillotine's efficiency, but precisely because of it. They came to verify that death could be this mundane, this mechanical, this utterly devoid of the ritual and process they associated with state execution. So why did guillotine executions attract crowds? The answer isn't simple bloodlust or morbid curiosity. It's something more psychologically complex and historically specific. The guillotine drew crowds because it transformed execution into something unprecedented, a perfectly predictable, mechanically guaranteed death. It removed every human variable: executioner skill, condemned resistance, timing uncertainty, method variation. In doing so, it created something people needed to witness to believe, that the state could kill with the reliability of a clock mechanism. Previous execution methods were dramatic precisely because they were unpredictable. Each one was unique. Missing an execution meant missing that particular expression of human suffering and state power. But the guillotine's promise was that every execution would be identical. This universality created urgency. If you'd seen one, you'd seen them all, so you needed to see one. The crowds also came for what the guillotine represented symbolically. Revolutionary equality made manifest. Rich and poor died the same death. The machine didn't care about your title, your crime, or your composure. It simply functioned. This mechanical equality embodied Enlightenment ideals in the starkest possible way. Perhaps most significantly, people gathered because the guillotine made death itself seem unremarkable. By reducing execution to 2 seconds of mechanical action, it revealed how thin the line between life and death actually is. Spectators came to confront this uncomfortable truth, that human existence could be ended as easily as dropping a weight down grooves. The guillotine's popularity reveals something about how we process state power, mechanical efficiency, and mortality. The device eliminated spectacle, which paradoxically made it the greatest spectacle of all. Its very mundanity, the reduction of death to a simple mechanical operation, is what made it impossible to look away from. The detail reveals the era's mentality, that progress meant making death rational, efficient, and egalitarian, even if that meant making it feel less human. The guillotine stands in our historical memory as a symbol of revolutionary terror, but understanding why crowds gathered to witness it reveals a more nuanced truth. They didn't come primarily for violence or entertainment. They came because the guillotine represented something genuinely new, the mechanization of state power, the engineering of certainty in what had always been uncertain, the reduction of death to pure function. This matters because it challenges our assumptions about what draws people to dark events. We often assume spectators at executions were fundamentally different from us, more callous, more comfortable with violence. But the historical evidence suggests they were grappling with many of the same questions we face. What does it mean when the state can kill with perfect efficiency? How should we feel about technological progress applied to death? What's our responsibility as witnesses to state power? The guillotine crowds weren't simply medieval holdovers enjoying barbarity. They were modern people, citizens of the Enlightenment, confronting what their ideals looked like in practice. Equality meant everyone died the same. Humaneness meant death should be instant. Progress meant removing human error from execution. The logical conclusion was a machine that killed with the precision of clockwork. They gathered to see whether these ideals, when made real, were actually what they wanted. The answer ultimately was no. Public guillotine executions ended not because people found them too gruesome, but because they'd become too mundane, too mechanical, too industrial. The state killing citizens had become a factory process, and that finally made society uncomfortable enough to move executions behind prison walls. The obscure reason crowds gathered then is this. They came to witness the moment when death stopped being human and became mechanical. They came to see whether that was progress or something else entirely. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of historical psychology interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the details history usually overlooks. What other historical objects or practices would you like to see explained? Let me know in the comments below.